There's a lot of pressure on Hamas now from the Arab League, who came out recently and condemned Hamas, condemned what they did during the massacre, and are calling for them to lay down.
That's a big deal.
Lay down arms. So we'll see if that pressure from the Arab League has any impact on Hamas. And Hamas is, we have no other options. And then will the Arab League really give Hamas some type of an exit strategy, where Hamas says, okay, we can leave Gaza and maybe set up for another day in another country for a future, or future attacks against Israel. Iraq and Syria's water flow has been greatly diminished over the last decade or so, and continues to be a huge problem. And of course, we follow this, and it's interesting, biblically, there is great significance associated with the Euphrates River. And we know in Revelation chapter 16, the Bible, in the context of the day of the Lord, in the context of God's eschatological end times judgment, one of the things that will take place, the Bible makes clear, is that the Euphrates River will run dry.
Welcome to this episode of Zion's Wire, the official podcast of Zion's Hope, where we bring you biblical discussions and prophetic insight with a passion for God, His people, and His plan for planet Earth. I'm Christopher Diaz, and joined today with David Rosenthal.
Hi, Chris.
Hey, so David, we've really been touching on a lot of current events the past few episodes, and I think rightfully so. There's so much happening right now in the Middle East, so much happening in Israel, and this past week has not wavered from that. There's been a lot more developments, and I think it's helpful for our audience, especially knowing your expertise in the area and flashpoints and geoprophecy news, that we kind of keep talking about some of these things that are happening because they're important.
Yeah, there's so many things that are taking place, as you mentioned. If you blink, you miss it. It's not like you have to wait months and months for something to come out of the Middle East. Every day there's some new developments, and very significant ones at that. One of the things that I think was very significant in the last few days is the interview that Prime Minister Netanyahu gave from Israel, and where he shared some very significant things and dealt with some issues related to accusations against Israel, largely by the news media in the West and around the world, against Israel and some of the things they're doing, how they're prosecuting the war in Gaza. And of course, focusing on the humanitarian, issues and accusations of genocide. The reality is that any accusation against Israel, talking about genocide, is nonsense. I'm just being very, very blunt.
Right.
Israel takes great measures, and I knew this prior, directly from people who fought in the IDF, for the IDF, through the years. And Prime Minister Netanyahu confirmed that Israel is doing far more than most armies or defense forces of any other nations, how they take precautions to make hundreds of thousands of cell phone calls, dropping leaflets to warn the population. So here they're combating a people and a terror group that runs this enclave in Gaza, who have perpetrated horrific acts against the Israeli population in the October 7th massacre. And Israel is fighting this war. And at the same time, though, they are taking immense measures to protect the civilian population there. Obviously, it's war, and there are tragedies that occur. And that's not to say that Israel doesn't make mistakes in some of the things that they're involved in and that they do. But to say that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza is utter foolishness and nonsense. They are going beyond what any other army, I think, in the history of the world has ever done to protect an enemy civilian population as they're prosecuting a war.
You're absolutely right.
And Prime Minister Netanyahu went on to say, when he was challenged or questioned about the rubble that's there, when you have reporters going in and they're seeing the devastation, obviously it's very significant. But he explained that a lot of these buildings are booby-trapped by Hamas. So when Hamas leaves the area after Israel warns the population, the civilian population, to leave, because Hamas has weapons depots or firing weapons from specific areas in Gaza, and Israel says, hey, population, you need to leave for your own protection, Hamas leaves booby-trapped buildings behind, and then those buildings have to be detonated in order to diminish the risk to Israeli soldiers coming in.
Nobody's covering that, really. I think that's a super important note because, oh, yeah, I read another headline there. They're demolishing civilian buildings, all the civilian buildings. But there's a reason why, and the civilians cannot and will not ever be able to go back to those buildings.
They're not going to be able to return back to those buildings because they've been booby-trapped. So Israel detonates them to make way as they move in. But again, the civilian populations could never go back to those buildings in any safety, even before Israel did what it was doing. Also, there's so many tunnels and underground facilities that Hamas has been building for decades. And when those tunnels are imploded, taken out of commission, the buildings on the surface oftentimes are demolished as well and destroyed. So it's a combination of things. So that's one issue that Prime Minister Netanyahu addressed. Also, the food distribution. That's been very significant. And of course, there have been a lot of images that have been splashed across headlines on the New York Times and others around the world. Of children or a child that really appeared emaciated, and it was tragic no matter what the cause. But in this case, it can not be laid at the feet of Israel. There was the child had an illness prior to this whole conflict, and so that was proven to be false and a propaganda piece.
Exactly, a lot of propaganda that they really push out there, and I'm continuing to see a lot of that debunked. And you get these side images that show what's really going on.
Yeah. So, but obviously there are humanitarian issues. It's a chaotic situation and it's a crisis situation. But Israel's doing, doing all that it can to get food to these people. The problem is that once the food gets across the border, a lot of it is confiscated by Hamas. Hamas is more than happy to use their own civilian populations as human shields, and even when the population doesn't want Hamas, and we're hearing about that more and more, that the people living in Gaza who just want to live their lives, raise their families, they realize that they know that Hamas is the problem, the source of the issue. And many of them are trying to fight back, or at least to leave the area when Israel is saying, look, leave the area for your own protection and safety. And then Hamas is threatening the population when they go to leave, when they try to leave the areas. And they're confiscating the food and then selling it for exorbitant prices to those who have the capacity to purchase it. So it is certainly problematic with the food situation and the distribution of the food. But Israel, through a variety of means and through some international sources, particularly from the United States, trying to get that food distributed to the people of Gaza. And then he also addressed the area of, and really that interview was on the precipice of a vote within the Israeli Security Council just a few days ago. And that vote was taken in favor of Israel and the IDF forces going into Gaza City. They've really been there since the beginning of this conflict, but to really take over Gaza City. And that's significant because it's the northernmost and most populated city in Gaza, and it poses geographically the biggest threat to Israel because of its location in northern Gaza, close to Israeli population centers. Close. And so Israel's made the decision to go in officially to take over Gaza City, and they had been actively promoting and pushing the population of Gaza living in Gaza City to move to the south over the last year and a half. Many have, but there are some who still remain, and there are isolated pockets of Hamas terrorists that are still in Gaza City, and Israel needs to root them out, and they want to do it once and for all. And so Israel said, we're going to go in, we're going to take over Gaza City, and all of this, again, is designed to move the population to areas where they can get this humanitarian support and where Israel can root out Hamas once and for all.
And that was an important note I saw, that it's not just hey, we're going to pull you out of this area. Again, this is a very harsh environment to live in, but they're bringing the aid outside to where they can actually get to the aid,
Right.
and have the civilians going to those areas. I mean, Hamas has really lived up to their name sake. They have no consideration for human life,
No.
and are just really after everyone, their own people included.
Yeah, yeah, and Israel has said, look, what our objectives. We want to eradicate Hamas. They need to lay down their weapons. We want to get the hostages, returned, and they're looking to have even though Israel's going to take it over, they're saying we want to take it over. Israel has no interest in governing Gaza. They'd been down that road before. They don't want to govern Gaza, but they do want to make sure that their security interests are handled and dealt with, and that the hostages are returned, and that Hamas is no longer a threat to Israel. But Israel has said that they are willing to have Arab forces come in once that is taken care of to really govern Gaza. And of course, that's very controversial. Right. I think the Arab forces are open to doing that. The problem is that Israel says in the doing of this, they don't want the Palestinian Authority, which is the Palestinian ruling group in the West Bank areas of the Palestinian locations within Israel. They don't want the PA, the Palestinian Authority, as part of that Arab force, as part of that governing group over Gaza, because they've been proven to be corrupt and inept. And so therefore, Israel is not interested in having the PA as part of any governing Arab force that would come into Gaza in the future. And the Arab forces, the Arab nations, say, no, we want there to be the Palestinian Authority to be part of this group, because it looks like they're supporting the Palestinians when they say that.
Yeah, and it's interesting, and we've talked about this in the office, just even the surrounding nations, Egypt particularly, bordering Gaza, they will say a lot of things about how bad they think the situation is, but have they yet opened their border to assist civilians that do need aid?
Yeah, it's quite remarkable. Like you said, Egypt is right at the southern border with Gaza, and yet there have been very little reporting. There's been very little reporting done on Egypt's role in this, and Egypt's unwillingness to allow any of the Palestinians to move out of these dangerous areas and to get further south and to come into the Sinai. I mean, Egypt has a tremendous land area of the Sinai right along the coast just to the south of Gaza, and Egypt has no interest whatsoever and has fought it every step of the way, allowing any of the Palestinians from Gaza into Egypt. But there's been almost no international pressure on Egypt, at least in the news media, for them to do so.
Yeah. And you mentioned just a moment ago some of the objectives that Netanyahu and the council was discussing, and I have some notes here that there are specifically 5 points. One is to disarm Hamas. 2 is the return of the hostages, both living and deceased. Demilitarization of the Gaza Strip. Israel security control for the time being of the Gaza Strip, and the establishment, as you mentioned, of a civilian administration that is not Hamas, that is not the Palestinian Authority. Right. So they, like you said, don't want to rule it. They want to end what has been happening and then move on.
Yeah. And I think it's very interesting and very notable that when Prime Minister Netanyahu is talking and he speaks of an Arab force or Arab forces joining together to come in to really govern the enclave of Gaza after this is over. It's interesting that in that same interview, he was very clear in that he believes that one of the key issues that precipitated the massacre in the first place, where Hamas came in and murdered and raped and took hostages in Israel, that what precipitated that was the attempt to disrupt the normalization process between Saudi Arabia and Israel, essentially to disrupt the expansion of the Abraham Accords, where Israel had signed normalization agreements with the UAE, with Bahrain, with a few other countries. Saudi Arabia was really next on the list, and that was really being talked about extensively prior to the October 7th massacre. And both Saudi Arabia, the crown prince there, Mohammed bin Salman, and then also Prime Minister Netanyahu, had talked very warmly and openly about the potential in the near future for some type of a normalization agreement. and how it could change the entire Middle East. And I found it very interesting that Prime Minister Netanyahu in this recent interview really came out and said overtly that he thinks one of the key issues of the October 7th massacre and what precipitated it was the attempt to disrupt this normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. So now when you talk about an Arab force coming in to rule over Gaza, I think what Prime Minister Netanyahu has in mind is the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, maybe Egypt as well, coming in to do that. And I think he's thinking in terms of, okay, we want to get these Abraham Accords and this normalization process back on track. And that would make sense in light of inviting these Arab forces to come in to rule over Gaza, which is right on Israel's doorstep.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, because they have to have that established trust or agreement at least, right? To really say, hey, who can govern this area and prove that they're not at the same token just taking it over.
There has to be trust in order for Israel to invite them in, again, in this geographic location, which is so close to Israel's major population centers, not that far south of Ashdod and Ashkelon and Tel Aviv. And not very far from Beersheba, a large city in southern Israel as well.
I mean, I remember just while we were there on our last trip, I could hear the sound of the tank fire while we were standing at the site of the Nova massacre.
Yeah.
We could hear live activity happening just what seemed like a few hundred yards away.
Yeah. So all of this, I think, is connected to, as we mentioned before, a transformation of the Middle East through this normalization process, through the expansion of the Abraham Accords. And why does Prime Minister Netanyahu keep alluding to it? Because it is connected to IMEC, which is a significant trade route, not just for commerce, telecommunications, and so many other factors and so many other things related to this trade route from India through the United Arab Emirates, through Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Israel, and from Israel on to Europe. And that is, I think, one of the key components in this mix, that if you have economic connectivity between these really former enemies, where they can work together for their mutual economic benefit, and this is how I think President Trump sees it, that we can really redefine and recreate the Middle East in a new vision. And I think that there are specific entities like Iran, like Russia, like China, maybe like Turkey, who don't want to see this happen. And so I think you have this push between these competing factions to see whether this normalization is actually going to take place or not. And that goes to the issue of, if it does, it goes to the issue of these Arab forces coming in and really governing Gaza in the post-war conflict.
Yeah, it's a rock and a hard place. And you look at what Israel's having to do and deal with. And at this moment in time, that decision, while you can look at it from many ways, there really doesn't seem to be a way that the hostages at this moment in time are going to be just released. Hamas has been very, very clear in the way they've operated. You cannot trust them. Mm-hmm. So if this is going to find closure, this appears, and I'm not going to just stamp it, but it appears like the approach that they need to take is address Hamas so that these Arab nations can then get on board with hey, okay, we'll take control. And who's that going to be, and what's that going to look like?
Yeah.
Because they can't get to that next conversation without addressing the fact that this is still happening, that there are still bombs flying, still missiles going, and Hamas is still declaring their end goal is the elimination of Israel.
Yeah, and the question is, are they going to be? Is Hamas going to be provided with some type of an escape exit that is, sufficient for their purposes, or are they just going to fight to the death and do whatever it takes? It seems like the latter, that they're not going to lay down arms. They're just going to fight to the death. But there's a lot of pressure on Hamas now from the Arab League, who came out recently and condemned Hamas, condemned what they did during the massacre, and are calling for them to lay down.
That's a big deal.
Lay down arms. So we'll see if that pressure from the Arab League has any impact on Hamas, and Hamas says we have no other options. And then will the Arab League really give Hamas some type of an exit strategy, where Hamas says, okay, we can leave Gaza and maybe set up for another day in another country for a future, for future attacks against Israel. That remains to be seen, as to what's going to happen. But things are getting very interesting. I do think that the approach of the 2-year anniversary of the massacre on October 7th is kind of a symbolic and significant date in the mind of President or Prime Minister Netanyahu, President Trump, and trying to wrap this up with some type of a resolution prior to that. We'll see if it goes beyond, but I think that is a natural point to which they would like to see some type of resolution take place, if not symbolic. I think just because it's going to be going on in 2 years, and I think many within the Western world and other parts of the world and within the Middle East and Israel want to see this wrapped up and see the hostages come home.
Yeah, and the prophetic implications of this are just still staggering. They're huge. With that in mind, though, there's some other things happening around in the Middle East.
There are.
That are drawing attention, and specifically Iran. So let's hop over to some things that are happening.
Yeah, well, everybody's attention really is focused on Gaza right now, but there's something very important happening in Iran that's gotten relatively little coverage in the news media, and that is Iran, especially Tehran, the capital, is going through a very, very problematic water shortage. They have had, I think, about 5 straight years of drought in that area. It's already a very dry area, mountainous but very dry, and they get far fewer inches of rain than many other nations in the region and around the world. And so it's already a problem for them, but they've had 5 straight years of drought. And you have Tehran, which I think has about 9 million inhabitants. So it's a huge city. And what I've been reading is that within a 100-mile radius of Tehran, all of the rivers or lakes that they have at their disposal to use for water are all deeply, deeply receded. And to the point where even the authorities in Tehran were giving people a day off just to get out of the city, just to reduce the need and the use of water. There's even talk about giving people like a week-long holiday to be able to get out of the city, to take the pressure and the strain off of the water situation. And what they're saying is that it could be within, if the extreme temperatures, some of the temperatures they've been experiencing are close to 120 degrees Fahrenheit.
I saw that, yeah.
And so it is just, from the air conditioning to everything else related to water consumption, they're really trying to get people out of the city in order to preserve what they have left. But, some will say, oh, it's global warming and other things. But when you really dig down and do a little bit more research on it, what we're finding and what we're hearing from experts is that there's just been a total mismanagement of the water supply in that region, in Tehran and in northern and northwestern Iran.
And this touches on some of we mentioned the bodies of water, but in particular, there's a river that has been going down a little bit. And I think, I don't know if you had this in your notes there, but we have 4 major rivers in that region that are very biblical in name, but particularly the Euphrates.
Yeah.
And the level of that river has been dropping.
Yeah, the Tigris and Euphrates, which really start in Turkey, and they make their way south into Syria and into Iraq. There's some impact that they have in northwestern Iran, some of the tributaries that have had some impact on northwestern Iran. Most of Tehran, the capital of Iran, is not impacted directly from the Tigris and Euphrates River. But it's not just, as you mentioned, it's not just Iran that's having this water shortage problem. This is in Iraq as well. And they've had years of water problems, but it's been exacerbated, made worse, because Turkey is actively building dams within Turkey proper, close to the border of Syria and Iraq on the Tigris and Euphrates. And so Iraq and Syria's water flow has been greatly diminished over the last decade or so, and continues to be a huge problem. And of course, we follow this, and it's interesting, not only, of course, because we're concerned for the people in the region. We don't want to see people suffer with water shortage, whether it's in Iraq, Syria, Iran, wherever. But biblically, there is great significance associated with the Euphrates River. And we know in Revelation chapter 16, the Bible, in the context of the day of the Lord, in the context of God's eschatological end times judgment, one of the things that will take place, the Bible makes clear, is that the Euphrates River will run dry. And the intent of that, the purpose of that, is to prepare the way for the kings of the East, the armies of the East, to come in across that river and come into Israel in the Battle of Armageddon. So all of this is very significant. I would say I wouldn't go out on a limb and say, because we're seeing these trends and these water problems, the crisis really that's there in that region in Iran and Iraq. I wouldn't say that we're there at the end of the age. I wouldn't say that we've arrived.
Right.
But we could be seeing the start of a continuing process by which there is continual water problems in the region, and there is a continual growing of the Euphrates River drying up in moving us towards the end of the age. It's possible that things could swing back for a time, and that it may not be in the news. It may not be a problem in the coming months and years. But what this shows us, regardless, is that the natural capacity for these rivers and for the water to dry up in that region is there. We're seeing it, and whether the Lord uses natural means to implement the drying up of the Euphrates River in the last days, or whether there's some direct involvement where he's supernaturally drying up the river to prepare this way for the armies of the East to come in and to come against Israel at the end and to set up the Battle of Armageddon. We don't know how that will be, but it is of more than little interest for those who study Scripture and know of that prophecy specifically of the Euphrates drying up, that we take note of what's taking place in Iran. And interesting to see, in light of Iran's aggressiveness in the region over the past couple decades and animosity, hatred toward Israel, interesting to see how they are now struggling immensely with the most basic necessities, which is water.
Right. And we see throughout Scripture that the supernatural components that happen aren't limited by God and how he uses the nation's leadership and different things to bring about his will.
Sure.
So his sovereignty at work could be, and again, not, as you said, not saying this is it, but man-made things could be part of that plan.
Sure.
To say, hey, some of these things are happening because ultimately he's brought it about through different means than we can pinpoint and say.
You hit the nail on the head. God uses people and nations and leaders to bring about his purposes.
Yeah.
So however he chooses to do it, we know from Scripture it's going to happen.
Right.
We just don't know exactly the method, the means, and the timing.
Yeah. And, one thing is clear. I mean, since the establishment, or reestablishment, I should say, of Israel in 1948 to now, it is very clear that it is a nation to be reckoned with in terms of its ability to protect itself, to stand up, and have a seat at the table of nations, especially with the support of the U.S. And so it seems to me, as we're looking ahead, it is much easier to see that the biblical dates, or not the dates per se, but the things that are to happen really fall into the picture of next phase. We're there. There are things that have been staged before us that you really can't see it going any other way. It's like, here it is. And the Bible says Israel will be, we're all going to be talking about it.
Yeah, it'll be. It's the center of the earth.
Yeah,
Jerusalem is the center of the earth, the navel of the earth, and nations don't understand why. Kings, world leaders don't understand why such a small little geographic area with a relatively small population in relation to the whole Middle East and the whole world. Why is the world continuing to focus and talk about Israel? And it is because this is a spiritual conflict at its core. Jerusalem and the Temple Mount is at the center. And as we mentioned, and we'll continue to mention, that because that is the center of the earth, whoever controls in God's plan and economy, whoever controls Jerusalem and specifically the Temple Mount, essentially controls the world. And this is all a spiritual conflict. It's moving closer to that climactic moment when ultimately Jesus Christ will come to return, and he will rule and reign from Jerusalem on the earth. So everything is moving in that direction. Nations and kings, and I said leaders, don't understand why they're so inextricably drawn to Jerusalem and to Israel and to what is happening there. It is a conflict that has raged since the Garden of Eden and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and the establishment of Israel. It is a spiritual conflict at its core, and it's not going away until God brings all things to proper fruition.
Yeah. That, I think, is a great place to pause here and actually set the stage, I think, for what is to come in the coming weeks. Some of our audience and listeners have actually even asked the question of how do we handle or talk about Israel and the rise in anti-Semitism? How do we address that as the body? And so to our audience, we are going to be getting into those topics here in the next couple of weeks with Dave Rosenthal. We'll bring in one of our pastoral team members as well and really jump into supersessionism, which is really replacement theology, and where this goes and how we as believers, and particularly Zion's Hope stance, and how we should address some of these things and deal with them in the public spaces. So that's coming. So we'll have answers for your questions.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah, and continue to follow along. Download the app, stay connected with us, and we look forward to connecting with you again soon.
Thanks for joining us today on this episode of Zion's Wire, a podcast fueled by a passion for God, His people, and His plan for planet Earth. If you were encouraged by today's episode, share it with a friend and subscribe, or follow us on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. Help us reach more people with the message of hope by leaving a 5-star review and download the Zion's Hope app for additional teachings and content. Keep the conversation going with questions or comments. Until next time, keep watching, keep praying, and keep your heart fixed on God's Word.